session of our study of the Bible. Um, as you join us, well, they won't be able to know what I'm saying. So,
Yeah,
but
because there's no one on yet.
we're now on both YouTube and Facebook. Though
Mm-hmm.
I now understand what that
2-2.
2, 1, 2, and 2 means. So we're getting there.
You're 2-2.
So
Shall we wait until someone signs on?
no.
Oh,
There we
there's
go.
someone signing on.
You're so desperate for an
I know,
audience.
I know. I want to know who's watching.
Good morning, 3 people. Good morning, 3 people.
4 people.
It's going crazy. Say hi, and we'll say hi back. Good morning. Welcome to another week of the study of the Bible.
5.
Karen, good morning. Hello to you. We hope you're well, and we're happy that you've joined us today. Last week, we took a step back and did a kind of overview of what we've been doing over the past few weeks regarding the story of Noah and the ark and the flood. Good morning, Vern. This week, we're going to take a final dive into the story, highlighting particular scriptural moments and discussing what they could mean before taking a final look at the story and putting it into the context of what goes before it in Scripture and what comes after it in Scripture. And we will be looking at a very, 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 very contentious part of Scripture. You know, the title of this is A Wrathful God and the Biblical Witness. The funny, the scary, and the just plain weird in our Bibles. How would you define it? It's scary, isn't it? The last part of what we'll be doing today.
Well, it's really odd.
Yeah, and
really
it's
odd.
not nice. And so there's a kind of heads up as to what you can expect today. So we've now completed our look at literary types. We've highlighted particular scriptural things with various what are they, literary type moments. And remember that the list we gave you wasn't exhaustive. It was written in order for you to kind of whet your appetite and deepen your understanding and love for Scripture, so that you don't just look at it as a text with absolutely zero insight, but then you start thinking, well, is this poetry? Is this that and the other? What's it trying to say? And good morning, Laurie. Good to have you with us this morning. So let's move on. Let's move into the text of Genesis. And let me get a slide going. Oh, I wonder why that happened. Ta-da!
Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. From the Garden of Eden to God's decision to destroy the earth, we have the bridge between them that is the story of Cain and Abel. From there, things decline and accelerate quickly. God's original plan of bringing the world of the Spirit and of creation together is thwarted by violence and corruption. In effect, these had nullified God's vision of extending the Garden of Eden across the earth. From God wanting his original creation to be a joint venture between himself, the things of heaven, and the things of earth, with humanity working God's will to extend God's realm, so to speak, God finally decides that some kind of fresh start was required. But even here, God didn't do it in a solo fashion. He enlisted Noah and his family to be a part of this plan. Once we hear God speak of his plan to end all violence by making an end of all flesh, God instructs Noah with detailed plans as to what Noah was to build. We take up the text now from chapter 6, verse 17.
For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh, which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, and keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. The opening lines here, for my part, let us know of this joint venture God has invited Noah to join. It's imperative that Noah build the ark, and then, of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. There are a couple of curious phrases we need to look at here. The first curious phrase involves the words, and every living thing of all flesh. To our minds, we might assume that what is living would be flesh. So is this just one of those redundancies, a repetition that is just stressing the point, or is something else going on? Father Lewis mentioned a non-biblical book known as the Book of Enoch. This book, although not officially recognized as biblical canon, has been influential, very influential, both in Judaism and in early Christianity. Ascribed by tradition to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, the Book of Enoch contains unique material that claims knowledge about the origins of demons and the Nephilim, about why some angels fell from heaven, and gives an explanation of why the Genesis flood was morally necessary. If we keep the Book of Enoch in mind, as may well have been true of those writing the narrative of Noah and the flood, we can see that Noah's flood may well have been written with a fallen spiritual realm being a part of the story. Hence the reference to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die, kind of makes sense. It's only after saying this that God promises a covenant between every living thing of all flesh. I'm adding this point because it is one of the contexts that may well have been at play when writing and or understanding the story. And although it creates more uncertainty about the story, it adds a supernatural layer it would otherwise be without, something that may well turn out to be important later on. Now to the other curious phrase. But before we do that, let me just look at Kit. We are watching on phone as we return home from taking Holly Doggy to the park. Oh, good. On the phone. Wow, modern technology. Watching on anything. And good morning to Anne. Hiya. So what's the other curious phrase? Well, the other curious phrase is, and every living thing of all flesh. Yes, it is the same phrase again. Yes, I kind of kidded you there. This time, though, we're looking at it in a literal way. We are asking the question, was the ark to contain every single creature in the world? An initial look at Scripture would suggest that yes, the Bible does mean we include every single creature as a passenger in the ark. The thing is, though, we learned last week that what was the known world then was basically what we know of as the Middle East. The truth is that if we take these words literally, then we have 2 problems here. The first problem is the animals from outside the known world somehow managed to get on board. How did that happen? And if they did get on board, the ark simply would not have been big enough, given what we know about its size and structure and what we know of animals. So if nothing so far has led you to believe that the story of Noah, the ark, and the flood is a narrative device to tell us something true about humanity, human wickedness, then maybe these 2 points will.
So let's not take those words literally, but see them not only as hyperbolic, but also in some sense true. 2 rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris, were known to flow through what was once known as Mesopotamia, a place we now know as Iraq. Scientists discovered that there are several layers in exposed rocks near these 2 rivers in the southeastern region of Iraq that are likely to be flood deposits. Most of these deposits are about a foot thick, but one is almost 10 feet thick. The flood debris from this thick deposit along the Euphrates River, which would place it near the ancient Sumerian city of Shuruppak, has been dated using carbon-14 dating, giving us an age of around 2,900 BC. Flood deposits of almost 8 feet have also been located in the far northeast as close to the ancient Babylonian city of Kish. Kish, no R. Kish.
Isn't that a food? Kish.
Kirsch.
That's kefir. What? Well, yeah. It's Kish.
Kish. What we can glean from this research is that many flood deposit layers show that flooding in southeastern Mesopotamia was not unusual in ancient times. Thus, we are back to seeing the story as a narrative device that tells us something true about who we are. When we move into chapter 7 of Genesis, we are told how the who, the ark, animals, flood saga worked out. There are a couple of things to note in this chapter. First, let's look at verse 2. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, male and its mate. Now, we have a question. Where did the notion of clean and unclean animals come from?
Well, some might suggest that sacrifice was already a thing by pointing to Genesis 4 and say that Abel brought a sacrifice from the firstborn of his flock. But this nugget of information is iffy. For if we read the actual context of it, we find that it says, "Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel for his part brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard." Here we read that both Cain and Abel brought an offering to the Lord. And although we are told Abel offered the fat portions of his firstling flock, there's nothing to suggest that Abel performed a sacrifice of those firstlings. Now, there are arguments both for and against the idea of offering meaning sacrifice, but it's far from clear. And it's one of those where if you were answering a question during an exam, you'd say, scholars are divided, and you get a point straight away. So it's one of those things where scholars are divided on this very point. So once again, and regarding chapter 7, it seems we have people writing into this narrative things that were the norm of their own experience. And remember, within the first few weeks, we talked about the 5 contexts. And when they were looking at this and they were living in their own context, which was one of sacrifice, they were thinking, well, if they're going to do that, then it must be a sacrifice. And, they may have just added something. We can't be sure. We just cannot be sure. But it's accepted that God informed the patriarchs later on as to what was considered clean and unclean, because all we need to do is go to the book of Leviticus and chapter 7 to find that out. So it could be, and I would posit that it's more than likely that what's written in Genesis was written back into the story from people's experience of sacrifice.
That concept of sacrifice
yeah.
is being written back.
Thank you for clarifying my...
Yes.
Oh, do you know I'm writing a book? I've finished it. 400 pages. It's called How to Be Concise. All right, we will now move...
You sure it's only 400 pages?
Well, I'm doing the addendum now, so who
okay.
knows? We're going to move directly to chapter 8 and through verses 20 and 21. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every kind of clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. And the first thing we notice is that once again, sacrifices are written into the narrative.
Yeah, we have been leaping about, but now we find ourselves in chapter 9. And immediately we find ourselves asking the question, let's look at these first few verses. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood.
Now, is it me, or is this part of Scripture inferring that humans were vegetarians before the flood?
Well, it kind of does suggest that, but what are we to make of that earlier verse from chapter 4 where Abel offered the fat portions of his firstlings to God?
Well, maybe that's the reason God had no regard for Cain's offering. Perhaps it was Abel's willingness to kill something that made God say about Cain's jealousy of Abel. And if I can find slide 14, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master this. Now, of course, this is all conjecture, but the questions are real and the questions are there.
Indeed they are. But vegetarianism wasn't what caught my eye. It was something else.
Yeah. So what would it be?
The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. I've often wondered how Noah and the family managed to get all of the animals into the ark. The inference is, in this verse, that all animals were not afraid of humans until this point. And it is if an ordinance of God that they should now be afraid.
Yeah, I see. It seems like when God makes this edict, this becomes the time when he includes the part about meat becoming food. So prior to this, all nature and creation's hunky-dory and one with each other, kind of. Human sin starts creating problems, but only now does this disconnect between humans and nature take place. All right. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So, as well as inferring vegetarianism, there also seems to be an inference even, that animals should be dead before they're eaten.
Maybe some ancient civilizations did eat meat while the animal was still alive. it would ensure that the meat was fresh, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, I suppose it
And
would.
yeah, and even though it's not done today, well, it is in certain places. In Japan, ikizukuri, meaning prepared alive, is the preparation of sashimi, pierced food, made from living seafood. The most popular sea animal used in this type of preparation is fish, but octopus is typically the only species that is still moving when it's served on a plate. Another fish dish invented by a Taiwanese chef from Chayal is called yin yang fish, also dead and alive fish,
Dead on.
in which the body of the fish, but not its head,
Ooh.
is rapidly deep fried and served while the head is still fresh and moving. It is prepared extremely quickly with care not to damage the internal organs so that the fish can remain alive for as long as 30 minutes.
Just ugh. That is awful. I think I'll follow the Talmud here because, according to the Talmud and the sixth Noahide law, which is part of the 7 laws of the children of Noah, it sets out a moral and religious imperative not to eat of a live animal. And I want to go along with that. The Tosefta, which is the Jewish oral law from the 2nd century, contains even more explicit language. It says, a limb torn from a living animal shall not be eaten. So I would guess that if they make a law about something, you can bet somebody was doing that. And in my mind, it makes perfect. You're a desert wandering people. You don't have refrigerators. You've got a taste for meat. How are you going to keep it fresh? Well, if you manage to keep the animal alive and just eat it bit by bit, it's barbaric, but it kind of makes sense. But so I'm so glad they made laws about it. It's just awful.
Of course, the ruling about blood goes even further. So let's continue with the text. For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning for human life. And then it continues in what looks like poetic form. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind.
Now, these verses to me are really, really hard. Are they saying that God is keeping the score over every animal that eats another animal? Or is it saying that God is keeping a score over every animal that eats of its own kind? Now, hold on. Is this the verse that also was used to advocate capital punishment?
These verses have been very contentious for centuries for that reason. And this is a rabbit hole that is just too deep and too torturous for us to go down at this time. So let's move on with the text.
All right, I agree.
And you be faithful and be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living thing that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. In the Gilgamesh epic, Untapishtim is rewarded Untapishtim.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I'm glad there's a word that doesn't just roll off your tongue.
No, it does not. The the main character in this flood
That's
story
one way of putting
in,
it.
in the Gilgamesh epic, yes, is rewarded for his faithfulness with the gift of immortality. In the biblical story of Noah, Noah is rewarded with a promise of many descendants.
Mm-hmm.
This possibly gives us an insight into early Hebrew understanding of life after death. Regarding creation, God makes a promise to sustain creation.
God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And the bow is seen, me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Now, we discussed this portion of Scripture a couple of weeks ago, noting that the relevant word here is bow rather than rainbow, with God stating that he was ceasing hostilities against humans and creation by hanging up his bow, that he would never again war against humanity and nor cause creation to suffer. It kind of fits in with, from the vegetarian perspective, says Kit, I'm not sure that there's a substantive difference between eating the animals alive and cruelly keeping them and killing them for our food today. I think you're right with that. I mean, some of the more eco-friendly, organic people want to tell you that their food has had, their animals have had a good life before they go to slaughter. And I think in some ways that's better. But then when you find out about some practices of animals just being crated indoors and never seeing the light of day, and being farmed to such a huge level with foods that they were never designed to eat. Unfortunately, though, too many people seem to be at ease with that kind of thing.
But I think you have to remember that the Talmud regulates how animals are slaughtered.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it prescribes that they should be slaughtered in a painless way.
Yeah.
With the cutting of the jugular artery and vein.
And it's the same with halal food. I was once talking to an imam and asked him what made a food halal. And he said, it's not really anything to do with the way it's killed. It's the prayer that's said. And he said you could shoot a bird from the air, and as long as you said the prayer before it hit the ground, and he didn't have a smile on his face because I was looking at him and saying, "Are you kidding me here or what?" But he said, "No, that would be halal food." And the one thing that I got out of this was that we are so easy with what we eat. You know, we'll go to McDonald's, we'll go to Burger King, we'll stuff ourselves with a Big Mac and whatever the Burger King version is, and we won't think anything of it. When you say grace before a meal, the one thing that both Jews and Muslims do is they give thanks for the life that's been taken so that we can live. And that's something I remember before I say grace, even if it doesn't come out in the words. But it's a heavy burden. You've taken a life and you can't get away from that. Bill, so what did the bunny on your shirt eat? Holy hand grenade. Well, you're quite close. It is from one of the Monty Python movies, and it's I can't remember what it was supposed to be a very quiet, helpless little bunny that that some people claimed guarded a particular place, but when you try to get there, attack you. So these are the skulls of the people that it's savaged. It's a very funny moment in quite a funny film. Right, so yes. God has hung up his bow, God has said, I'm never going to do this again, either to humans or to creation. There's never going to be a flood. So, of course, our natural inclination is that when we view a rainbow, we see it of a reminder of God's covenant. But when God tells Noah about this part of the covenant, he says that the bow is there to remind him, God, about what he said. This is a very interesting anthropomorphization, that God needs a prompt to remember something. Don't you think? You'd think that one of the attributes of being divine is the perfect memory.
Well, I mean, we in Christian theology, we think of God as omniscient, knowing all things.
Yeah, and I hate those kind of...
Oh, yeah, those Greek terms.
Those iants, yes, they cause more problems. But yes, so in this instance of this anthropomorphization, we will see other anthropomorphisms throughout the Bible. So it's not on its own.
So we're going to continue with the text. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham, who was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he laid uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And so we come to the last few verses regarding Noah, the flood, and the ark. And once again, we come across a curious event. The following analysis is based upon the works of an author who calls himself Dex from the Straight Dope, which is from a website, straightdope.com. The verses prior to the one we now have before us included lofty poetry and grand promises following the flood. Here we have a brief description of a very bizarre event. This story, like many other of the earliest stories, almost certainly had an oral tradition before it was eventually written down. What this means is that a story told by word of mouth, which passed along from generation to generation. Now, immediately we might think of the game telephone, where someone passes a story on to someone else, who passes it on to someone else, and the story gets altered along the way. But stories that were transmitted within a community, and because of this, the community corrected any errors, making the story's transition remain surprisingly accurate.
Yeah, we see this in with the imams and the kids at
Midrash.
What's the school's called? I forgot what the name of the school. Oh, the little Muslim school.
Madrasa.
Something like that.
I think something like that, yeah.
Anyway, I've seen this happen. And the other kids will correct the kids who've gotten it wrong. And it's an amazingly effective way of doing things.
So this oral tradition is lost to us now, but it is important to remember that the initial audiences of the written version would have known the whole story and so wouldn't have needed to be told all the details.
Yeah, it's a bit like an inside joke, isn't it? That you only have to give part of the story, and everyone else goes, "Oh yeah," because they know the other details. But if you're outside, like, what?
Well, we do this in, say, American history when we talk about the honesty of George Washington, and immediately we can think of that chopping down the cherry tree story. But someone who is not inculcated with that information, they would not make that reference. They would not connect the two things. But that's how oral tradition, and once it's written down, those inferences are made by the hearer.
Yeah. Now, Kit's asked 2 questions. Kit, we will get to those at the end. We'll read those and look at them at the end. Okay.
We didn't know all the details, or when we hear the story, we don't hear all the details. So this means that we are left with speculation and guesswork.
Mm-hmm.
And just to remind you, we are engaged in literary textual interpretation, not historical veracity.
Yeah,
When
not
we
trying to prove this is a true story.
Yeah, it's not
We're
a
trying to-
historical event in the sense of a modern understanding of history.
We're looking at the text and we're saying, what is it saying? And then we realize we've got parts of it missing.
Yeah. When we consider Scripture as a whole, we will see that the only other person to get drunk in Scripture was Abraham's nephew Lot, who gets drunk after the destruction of Sodom. There are striking parallels with Noah's story, especially the sexual overtones that occur following a great disaster.
Mm-hmm. Now, the great news is that Noah seems to have discovered alcohol. The not so great news is that he also seems to have discovered the hangover. Along with this, Noah seems to have rediscovered nakedness, for that's how Noah's son Ham finds him when Ham goes to visit his dad. And so Ham goes into the tent, sees his father drunk and naked, and then goes out and blabs about it to his brothers. The 2 brothers turn up, going backwards so as to cover up their father without looking at him, and eventually Noah wakes up. But Noah doesn't wake up and think, where did this really nice blanket come from? It seems he immediately pronounced a curse. But he doesn't pronounce a curse on Ham, his son, but on his grandson, Canaan. Now, why did Noah behave this way? Well, the straightforward reading of the text is simply that Ham saw his naked father, left him that way, then gossiped about it to his 2 brothers, meaning that he ridiculed his father. So Noah's curse is because Ham was immodest, he lacked a filial respect, and he failed to protect his father properly. That's the literal reading.
I think it's interesting to see the parallels in this story of Noah, the flood, and the creation story.
Oh, yeah.
Where the Adam and Eve are naked in the garden.
And that's only them, they become kind of self-aware in it.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Yeah.
And that becomes evidence of their sin.
So what is it about nakedness? I mean, yeah, it seems to be the weirdest thing.
Yeah.
Especially when we still have societies where, for the most part, they live practically naked and nothing's said about it. You know, it's just what it is.
Well, there are obvious problems with this straightforward reading. The over-the-top nature of Noah's reaction suggests that there is something more sordid going on than simply ridicule. But what could it be? Well, speculation abounds, with most authorities on the subject thinking that there was an oral tradition that was left out of the written text for, how shall we say, reasons of decency. There are 2 main areas of speculation. The first speculation is that Ham either sodomized or castrated his father Noah. This has been inferred by some authorities from the fact that Noah had no children after the flood.
I love inferences. That's completely wild.
Indeed, there was a common interpretation made by both Jewish rabbinic scholars and early Christian fathers
So
that
this is
this was the
old
case.
then. This is old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another conjecture is that Ham used some magic spell to render Noah impotent.
That kind of feeds into the Book of Enoch and all
Yep.
the weirdness in there.
Now, most modern scholars view all the above interpretations as unlikely. The reason for this being that, among other things, the penalty for sodomy would have been death by stoning, not a curse on the perpetrator's child.
So the explanation here is that if it was written in, if it was understood to be the case because of an oral tradition, then because it was was being read back into, they would have inferred that somebody should have been stoned somewhere.
Yeah. The second speculation is just as odd, that Ham saw Noah having sex with someone other than Mrs. Noah. This is problematic if only because the other women around Noah's daughter other women around were Noah's daughter-in-law or his granddaughters. But this speculative interpretation arises from a fine technical point. Noah entered the ark with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. That is, first males, then females, separately. The implication, according to this view, is that sex was not permitted on the ark.
Technically, this is known as an argument from silence.
Yeah. And usually when arguments of silence are done, you kind of go,
You respond likewise.
yeah, I don't think so. To add to this possible pervasiveness of this interpretation is noted that Noah was told to exit the ark. Now this is Genesis 8:16, with his wife, his sons, and his sons' wives. That is by male-female pairs. They are now told to go repopulate the world. That is, they are now permitted to have sex. But if you look clearly, you'll notice that Noah didn't obey. The family exited the ark in the same order they came in. Males first, then females. Is Noah subverting the order of procreation? Was there some marital rift that interfered with the task of repopulating the world? Tune in next week to follow this troubled life in As the Ark Turns. No, the most reasonable explanation is that it is not about Canaan as an individual, but about his presumed descendants of many generations later. The Israelites viewed the Canaanites as an evil, corrupt people who engaged in sexually licentious acts. And if you see Leviticus 18:1 and following, where uncovering sexual nakedness was associated with the Canaanites. To add to this, modern scholars know that the Canaanite pantheon is among the most sexually violent of all pagan myths. So Ham is identified with his son and descendants, Canaan, destined to be subjugated by the Israelite monarchy in the 10th century BC. And regardless of when the story was actually written down, it is most likely refers to that period of literal enslavement of the nation Canaan by the Israelites.
Yes, maybe that's the reason God gave the lands of Canaan to the Israelites after their escape from Egypt, says Bill.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's obviously, it sounds a bit like the English and French historical hatred. I mean, it really doesn't exist in real life. When the English go to France and the French come over to England, we get on really well. But there's this, historical thing of the 3-year war, the 30-year war, the 100-year war, can we meet next Tuesday and fight war?
We own this plot of land.
No,
Get off.
No.
Ham. Finally, as a side note, the curse itself says that the Canaanites will be subjugated to the Israelites. And the name Canaan itself is a wordplay in Hebrew on a root that means to be humbled or humiliated.
Now we've heard the ideas of subjugation and slavery and enslavement, and these are horrible, horrible notions. No matter who the people are involved. There's a really, really scary thing about all this, though. Do you know that this portion of the text was used to justify slavery and subjugation of black people in the US? As the story gets settled into its historic context, it is sooner or later something that finds itself being interpreted by one people or another. And it's what we're doing. Now, the story of Noah wasn't written down until it was a wide period between maybe 1250 BC to maybe 600. So that's quite a large period. It wasn't until around 100 BC to around 400 BC that an influential period of biblical interpretation began, with important contributions being offered first by Jewish rabbinical scholars and then later by the early Christian fathers, or at least some of those early Christian fathers. Now, as we've hopefully learned over the previous few weeks, the context within which a writing is interpreted is as important as any of the other contexts. So it's important to know what was going on during the context of this major interpretive period, especially as it pertains to slavery. So strap yourselves in, because it's going to be a horrible ride. Now, generally speaking, slaves are mostly prisoners taken in war. In addition to this, though, during the Roman Empire, there flourished a black slave trade between Arabia and East Africa. The slave trade plus wars of conquest brought black people into the slave markets in the Near East, Greece, and Rome, places that were also the three main centers of biblical interpretation and scholarship for both the Jews and the Christians. Now, the percentage of slaves who were black was fairly small compared to those who were European or Western Asian. However, in these three centers, while not all slaves were black, all blacks were seen as slaves. On top of this, black slaves having a noticeably different color skin, and so visually they stood out. Stood out over time. That became something that was associated with slavery. In other words, if somebody pointed to a black person, the assumption was that person was a slave. And if this wasn't bad enough, this notion of black equals slave soon became reflected in the biblical interpretation of this story of Noah's curse. Within this terrible interpretation, two key elements were established. First, by around 150 AD, some commentators were claiming that the curse of slavery on Canaan either included Ham or was really a curse on Ham. Second, the curse somehow made Ham black-skinned. See the inference there? That's already bad enough. How did the biblical commentators arrive at this completely bizarre and obscene interpretation? How did biblical commentators radicalize a Bible story that says absolutely nothing about skin color or race? Well, it happened like this. After the story of drunken Noah and the curse of Canaan, on Canaan I should say, there's a table of generations listing 70 children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., who became 70 nations, repopulating the whole world. As mentioned previously, Judaism makes a lot about numbers, and the numbers 7 and 10 are seen as numbers that conjure up notions of completeness in the biblical texts. But the number 70 was also a special number, often being used to mean wholeness or completeness. Now, these earliest commentators looked at the story in its own context, which is the curse on Canaan, followed by the table of the genealogies, followed by the story of the Tower of Babel. And when they did this, they then interpreted that this sequence of stories was meant to explain human differentiation, that is, the different nations languages, and cultures that exist, and that they do exist because they were imposed on mankind by God Himself. Now, we can be sure about this because as early as the 1st century, Noah's 3 sons were connected with the then known 3 continents. That's all they knew, 3 continents. Shem was associated with Asia, Japheth was associated with Europe, and Ham was associated with Africa.
Of course, this wasn't the only interpretive model doing the rounds at the time. One medieval interpretation held that Noah's 3 sons represented the 3 classes of society: those who prayed, the clergy;
That be we?
those who fought, knights;
That won't be we?
those who worked, peasants and artists. That won't be we either.
Oh, I don't know.
Despite other opinions, though, the idea that Noah's children were the basis of later racial divisions, broadly put, blacks, whites, and Orientals, became very influential and gained wide currency. Ham, in this widespread view, had begotten the dark-skinned branches of mankind. In the tables of generations, 3 of Ham's children mentioned were claimed to be dark-skinned people: Cush, West Central Africa, south of Egypt; Mizraim, Egypt; and Put, Libya. Oddly, only Canaan, the one who was actually cursed in the Bible, was not dark-skinned. One of the things that ran in parallel with this notion at this time, the name Ham was believed to be related to the ancient Hebrew word meaning black, brown, or dark, as well as another word which meant hot, implying scorched by the sun. Nowadays, linguists completely refute this idea.
Yeah, garbage.
Thus, as in the way of errors, this interpretation grew to the point that many of Jewish rabbis and early Christian fathers linked Ham's descendants with dark skin and saw them as the mark, and saw that dark skin as the mark of Noah's curse. Definitive proof is easy to find, for we have statements to this effect from Origen, who lived from 185 to 254 AD, Augustine, 354 to 430, and Ambrose of Milan, 339 to 379. By the mid-700s, we find Christian, Jewish, and even Muslim writers commenting and sermonizing that Noah's curse on Ham was twofold: slavery and black skin.
We're now going to jump forward 1,000 years to the age of colonization, when these concepts were formalized and broadly accepted. In the 1500s, beginning in Spain and Portugal, physical status, like race, was being linked to social status, and so the slave stereotype was established. But the stereotype went beyond mere slavery. Ham was also a symbol of sexual transgression, based on interpretations that his offense against Noah was somehow sexual and that he was sexually loose in the ark. I mean, this is absolute garbage. So not only were black people destined to be enslaved, they were now connected with sexual depravity. And I have to say here that the Bible, for the most part, when it talks about people of color, it usually talks about them in distinguished terms of being tall and strong and mighty, like warrior types, not debased like this. This is
The
just,
Queen of Sheba.
yeah. The process was gradual, but more and more sermons and speeches began to use this, can you call it a reinterpretation? This garbling of the Bible, until the curse of Ham became the ultimate justification for slavery. Ultimately, this interpretation was used to explain not only why there were different races, but also why the black races were slaves. So by the late 1600s, the curse of Ham was well entrenched as a divine sanction for slavery. So it's hardly surprising to find out that in colonial America, the belief that Ham was black and that Noah's curse was race-related was widely subscribed to in both the North and the South. By the 1830s, when the American anti-slavery movement had become a political force, slavery advocates had evolved an elaborate, systematic defense of slavery, and they did it by arguing from Scripture, of all places. Historian Haynes writes, Noah's curse was a stock weapon in the arsenal of slavery's apologists, and references to Genesis 9, what we've been looking at today, appeared prominently in their publications. For example, J.J. Flournoy, writing in 1838, says, the blacks were originally designed to vassalage by the patriarch Noah. It being in the Bible even led to many black people accepting this interpretation as their God-ordained state. And can anything be more sad than that? By this point, any other meaning of this scripture had been left behind. This twisting of scripture was neither new nor unique, but that it affected millions of lives cannot be understated.
Fortunately, slavery was eventually abolished, but it wasn't done so because of a new interpretive lens that had been cast over this Noah-cursed text. In fact, even throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the notion that the lowly status of black people was divinely ordained was repeated in sermons and speeches. Noah's curse reemerged like a virus that refuses to die in the 1950s and 60s when Southern white Christians used it to justify racial segregation in the face of the civil rights movement. For example, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia read the text of the Noah story and its curse into the congressional record as part of a filibuster against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, saying Noah saw fit to discriminate against Ham's descendants. We could give examples from our world today, but it should be enough to state that although the Bible is a complex set of books containing many forms of literature, it has often been used to spawn a great deal of ideology that is not actually to be found in the text.
And as I've often said, you can use the Bible to support almost any point of view if you're willing to twist the words a bit.
Well, finally, the Bible consistently deplores and limits slavery. And while we never read of slavery being condemned outright,
which is a big pity,
the Bible does say that slaves must be set free in the 7th year of their enslavement, and that slaves cannot be mistreated, and so on. To be sure, the Bible was not written with modern sensibilities, but it has to be said that it was advanced for its time. Of course, people are still using the Bible for their own ends. The lie that is prosperity gospel comes to my mind here.
And to my mind, the so-called pre-millennial tribulation and rapture as a serious biblical interpretation is meh. That word covers it, okay.
By using the Bible to justify anything isn't going to stop because it simply works.
Yeah.
And we know this because even the devil quotes scripture when it suits him.
So that is where we find ourselves. And that means we finished this portion of Genesis. Sorry that it's been such a bummer, this last part, but it's a part of Christian history that needs to be revealed, and we should own it and disown it, because it is a part of our heritage. But it is, as we've shown, it comes from a real misunderstanding at its basis, and then it kind of grew from there to be a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. The thing, to my mind, is the people who were under the yoke of that misinterpretation actually believe in that God would say that it's not a God I would want to worship if he was partisan. So that is it for today. We do hope you've gotten something out of it. We will look at the 2 questions, maybe 3 questions. But before we do, I wanted to let you know that because of diocesan things that I've got to be doing, there will be no Bible study next week. So there is no Bible study on the 22nd today? 29th of September. We will resume the week afterwards. But what I do want to tell you about is something way better than any Bible study, and that is the blessing of the animals on Saturday, October the 2nd, which is not that far away. It begins at 10 o'clock, and we have a service which will be live streamed. So please don't visit us before then. Although you can do, you just will need to have your phone on or something to take part in the service virtually. And then we will be blessing your pets from 10:30 in a drive-through fashion like we did last year. There is one difference though. Last year you did it counterclockwise. This year you're going to drive in clockwise. So you're going to be driving in from, it's a new driving pattern. We switched it around. So the one-way entrance is now from 113th rather than from the church parking lot. So that is Saturday, October the 2nd. Let your pets bring you, because we know that they want to come. So it's just up to you to get them in the car. And we will get a chance to bless them and say hi to you. Please look for more for those of you who are church members. It will be in the weekly emails, and we'll add another advert for Facebook for those of you who see us online. So that's going to be really, really good, and I'm looking forward to that because I like me some pets to slobber all over me. Although I do miss the Newfoundlands all over you though.
Yes, I somehow always got the Newfoundlanders, and their handlers always came with a towel, and they were consistently mopping up the jowls of the dogs.
Yeah, they do
slobber. Every once in a while, I would get a whole lot of slobber, but it was loving slobber.
There's an excellent photo of you just looking like you've been soaked with one of those huge soakers. All right, let's go to these questions. Here we go. How does God's covenant, these are from Kit, how does God's covenant affect his proclamation that animals be afraid of humans? Is he changing that condition as well? Well, at the end of everything, yes, because the lion will be with the lamb, so it's going to be reversed. But part of the covenant condition seems to be that, well, the covenant was to do with all of creation, and it was to do that with God not causing a flood again, a flood of universal proportions. But there were new conditions set as to the behavior between humans and their interactions with animals. So it seems to be from the get-go that this is when humans can begin to eat flesh.
It also is what is called an etiology.
Yes.
It's an attempt to explain why things are the way they are.
Mummy, why am I eating yet another chicken wing?
Why are the animals afraid of us? Because that was, we know that that's the case. And so the writers are trying to explain something that is what they're trying to explain their current condition or their current experience.
I hope that helps. The second one is, how does the covenant affect God's seeming permissions that we can do as we will with animals? Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Yes, we are stewards. What was the word we used last week? I've forgotten now. It's a word we use incorrectly. We have dominion over them, and we are supposed to care. And if we are to eat animals, then we should give them the best possible life, and then we are to slaughter them in the kindest. I mean, is there least cruel way? I mean, it sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? I'm going to kill you nicely. It's just awful.
I wish I could remember the actual title, but there is a book written by a animal behaviorist who is autistic, and she has been employed by slaughterhouses to analyze what is happening and how animals are responding. And she has been able to make changes in the way that animals are killed so that it is less traumatic for them.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like, some Jesuitical argument.
I mean, one of the reasons we're in the state we're in is because we like our food to be cheap. And the cheapest way is to mass produce.
Market.
And the companies, being the companies, are going to do whatever it takes to give you the biggest chicken breast. I'd never seen a chicken breast so big. I didn't know it was possible until I came over here, because it's a long time since they banned growth. Well, it wasn't growth hormone. Antibiotics act as a growth hormone. It's a cheat. When it says on the pack, no growth hormones used, it doesn't matter.
Dolly Parton chickens.
I'm never going to be able to look at her again and say, that's horrible.
Or I can say Mae West chickens.
Yeah, and feeding cattle corn, a very unnatural thing, but it bulks them up so quickly. Yeah, that's just awful. And there are too many videos showing what goes on in slaughterhouses that, just no. So, yes, how does it change how we deal with animals? We should be kind to them. We should see them as co-inhabitants on this planet. And yet, as I speak, another animal is becoming extinct. Because, was it 30 a day or something ridiculous like that? 30 animals because of what we do into the environment. But the other horrible side of things, and I know we're going on a bit here, is that too many Christians buy into this, not giving a damn for creation, because they want Jesus to come back quickly.
And then also they have this interpretation, we have been given dominion over the earth, and dominion means to subjugate.
Yeah, which is not true. All right, I hope that helps. Maybe. Yes, you may well have seen books in Sunday school that depict
Ham
as black. Now, it's obviously going to be the case that there are some people who are black in the Bible, but there's nothing wrong with being black. It's more horrific when we see images of Jesus being this blue-eyed, blonde-haired, suave-looking thing that's just has come off the set of some Hollywood blockbuster, rather than some real Jewish village person, that's worked hard under the sun.
I'm reminded of there's a BBC little vignette,
Yes.
comic vignette.
If we can find it, we'll link it on Facebook.
But if you look for it on YouTube, it's called something about give me the white Jesus, and it is really, really funny.
Yeah, and it's
and very appropriate
and very true. Yeah, there are a few videos out there which do challenge a lot of people. There's one on the Holy Trinity done in a cartoon by the Lutheran
Church, yeah.
which is just spot on for trying to do Trinity Sunday. And this one, it actually does work well on people who have this really weird white image of Jesus, So yes, please do look for that. I think we should stop there.
Yes.
Again, Blessing of the Animals, Saturday, October the 2nd. The service will be online from 10 a.m. You're more than welcome to come in your car to have your animals blessed. We can give you a blessing as well, especially if you've got an animal who is a terror. We'll bless all cat owners. That's what I'll say. And until we see you again, either on Sunday or not next week, take care and God bless.
God bless.